The retina has a couple important parts that you should be aware of. First of all, the optic disc is the blind spot because there are no photoreceptors in this specific location, and it's located where the ganglion cell axons exit the retina to form the optic nerve, and blood vessels enter and exit the retina. Also, just lateral to the optic disc is a particular area which is called the macula luteae. In the very center of the macula luteae is a depression called the fovea centralis, which has the highest proportion of cones and almost no rods. On this image, on the left-hand side, you can see a view of the retina showing the optic disc, which is the blind spot. And just lateral to this area, we see a region called the macula luteae, and the very center of it is the fovea centralis. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can actually check your blind spot. To do so, close your left eye and hold this figure in front of your right eye and stare at the black spot. Move the figure towards your open eye, and at a certain point, the image of the plus sign, when it's over the optic disc, the plus sign will actually start to disappear, and you can see where your optic disc is. Other important eye structures that we have are a couple important cavities. There's an anterior cavity, which is located between the lens and the cornea, and it's filled with a fluid called the aqueous humor. This fluid will actually drain, and it flows through the pupil, so it's secreted into the posterior chamber, flows through the pupil, and then drains through a venous sinus called the scleral venous sinus, also called the canal of Schlemm. So the iris itself is going to subdivide this into an anterior chamber and a posterior chamber. So both the anterior and posterior chambers are within the anterior cavity. There's also a posterior cavity, and that's between the lens and the retina, and it's filled with a fluid called the vitreous humor. This is the humor that we have present throughout our entire life, and it's a gelatinous, transparent, and permanent fluid. So the visual pathways are first going to begin with the retinal photoreceptors. They convert light into neural signals. So the stimulus is passed to the bipolar cells and then the ganglion cells. And it's the ganglion cells which actually form the optic nerve. So the optic nerve from the left and right eyes both converge at the optic chiasm, where the axons from the medial retina cross over to the other side. And then beyond that, posterior to the chiasm is called the optic tract. From the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, axons are going to project to the primary visual cortex, which is part of the occipital lobe. On this slide, you can actually see this is an inferior view of the brain showing the visual pathways. On the left-hand side of a cadaver image, we can see highlighted the optic chiasm. On the figure that is to the right here, we can see the pathway for image formation, beginning at the retina, which is where the photoreceptors are located at. Posterior to the retina is the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2. The nerve then passes to the optic chiasm, where it crosses over to the opposite hemisphere. Posterior to that is the optic tract, followed by the thalamus, where it then passes to part of the brainstem, called the midbrain, and then eventually to the occipital lobe. It's not important that you know the part of the thalamus called the lateral geniculate or the pretectal nucleus of the midbrain. For our next sense, and notice we are skipping some of the senses like gustation as well as olfaction, but we are going to cover equilibrium and hearing. Equilibrium and hearing is the organs responsible for balance, which is equilibrium, and hearing. So the ear is divided into three separate regions: the external ear, middle ear, and inner ear. When we look at its anatomy, this is what we see. The external ear contains the auricle, the middle ear located in the temporal bone as well as the inner ear. The middle ear contains the ossicles, and the ossicles in order would be the malleus, incus, and stapes. So we can number them as 1, 2, and 3. We can see the malleus first is going to vibrate first. It's a mechanoreceptor. Then the incus vibrates, then the stapes. That causes the transmission of the sound into the inner ear. The inner ear contains the semicircular canals, as well as the cochlea and vestibule. And there are two important membranes: the membrane that's between the middle ear and the inner ear is called the oval window. The membrane that's between the external ear and the middle ear is called the tympanic membrane. For the external ear, as I mentioned, the main structure is called the auricle. Its job is to direct the sound waves into the external acoustic meatus, which eventually ends in the eardrum, called the tympanic membrane. The middle ear contains, found in the temporal bone, it contains air-filled tympanic cavity, and there is what's called the auditory tube, which connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx. This is what explains the fact that sometimes you get an inner ear infection because of something that's going on in your pharynx. So the three ossicles that are going to vibrate in order are the malleus, the incus, and then finally the stapes.